We will begin today by talking about his physical appearance, how he used to look, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and realize that it is the sunnah of Allah, it is the custom of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends prophets and messengers with the most perfect characteristics, inner and outer. And the reason He does so is so that mankind has no reason to reject this messenger. Every messenger has come with the most perfect characteristics, the most perfect mannerisms, and also perfect images as well. So the prophets, as a general rule, are all handsome in nature, and they are all with beautiful characteristics. And as we know, the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was given half of all beauty. And some scholars say that half of all beauty means half of all beauty of mankind. And this is the majority opinion. But there is another opinion as well, and I'm just mentioning this because to tell you there is another opinion there. And that is, some scholars say that when the Prophet ﷺ said half of beauty, he actually meant half of his own beauty. This is one opinion as well. He actually meant that half of his own beauty, because according to this opinion, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the most handsome and the most jamal of the entire creation. He has the greatest jamal of the whole creation. And so they say, when he is saying he's been given nisf al-husn, or half shatr al-husn is the hadith, half of beauty, some scholars have interpreted this to mean half of his own sallallahu alaihi wasallam's beauty. And we have many characteristics that have been described, the physical features of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And some of the more beautiful ones are, for example, Ar-Rubayy binti Muawwidh, one of the sahabiyat. When her son asked her, what was the Prophet ﷺ like? This is later on after he has passed away and she is now an old lady. So people are coming to eagerly describe the Prophet ﷺ. And so all she could say, and this is reported in At-Tabarani's Kabir and also Bukhari's Book al-Manaqib, all she could say was, Ya bunay, oh my dear son, if you were to have seen him, you would have thought that the sun had risen up. That's all he could describe. I don't know how to describe it to you. If you were to have seen him, you would have thought that the sun has now risen up. This is the rising sun. And it is amazing that Rubayy describes him as a sun, beautiful sun. Ka'b ibn Malik describes him as a moon. Ka'b ibn Malik, another famous companion, that he said that whenever the Prophet ﷺ was happy, his face would light up as if it was the full moon. And it is beautiful that the Sahaba are describing the Prophet ﷺ with what they know to be the most beautiful. And that is the sun and the moon. So we have one Sahabiya, she's saying he's like the sun shining. Another one is saying he's like the full moon. And one of my favorite introductions, if you like, to this whole topic, we're not actually describing him yet. We're simply saying how the Sahaba could not describe him. They couldn't describe how handsome he was, because it was too much for them. And my favorite tradition, wallahi, it is a tradition, it almost makes you want to cry when you listen to this. And this is the beautiful tradition of Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As is this Sahabi. Amr ibn al-As used to be of the leaders of the Quraysh who were against Islam. Amr ibn al-As is of the Mala, he's of the noblemen who rejected Islam. He's like Abu Sufyan, he's like Khalid ibn Walid. This category of people who were noble enemies. They weren't evil enemies, right? What I mean by this, you cannot compare them to Abu Lahab, to Abu Jahl. These are the vulgar enemies. There was a group of people, they opposed Islam, but they didn't stoop to dirty tactics. And the amazing thing, by the way, and we'll talk about this later on, Allah guided all of them to Islam. And this shows that amongst the kuffar, there are two categories. Those who have a good heart, you say this, wallahi we can say this, that they had a good heart. And because they had a good heart, Khalid ibn al-Walid, Ikrimah, the son of Abu Jahl, Amr ibn al-As, right? Abu Sufyan. Their hearts, they had amount of good in them. They had nobility, but they opposed Islam. And Allah guided all of them to Islam, because alim Allahu fi qulubihim khair. Allah knew there was good in their hearts, right? Whereas the others, they weren't like this. So Amr ibn al-As is of those who converted to Islam very late. And he only had the opportunity to be a Sahabi basically for a few years, 2 years or so, or a little bit more than 2. And later on in his life, and he lived a life of political career, he lived a life of grandeur and majesty, he became the vizier of Muawiyah, he lived a grand life. Amr ibn al-As later on would say that there was nothing that was more sweeter to me more beloved to me than to stare at the face of the Prophet ﷺ. Now I want you to pause here. This is not how a man talks usually, right? There was nothing more beloved to me than to stare at the face of another person. It's not how a man talks. But the beauty of the Prophet ﷺ is so overpowering. His jamal, his nur is so great that Amr ibn al-As is saying, there was nothing that I got more peace from, more serenity from, more ahla, was nothing sweeter than to simply look at the face of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And yet, and he said, and I could never get enough of looking at him. I never got tired. There was no malal. I never got tired of looking at him. And yet, were you to ask me how he looked, I couldn't describe him. Were you to ask me how he looked, I couldn't describe him. Why? He said, because along with this desire to stare at him, there was also this awe, this reverence that I had that couldn't allow me to just stare directly at him, and I'd have to lower my face. In other words, there are two emotions. If you like, there's two powers, if you like. I don't like being metaphysical, but there's two types of powers emanating from the Prophet ﷺ. The first of them, he's attracting Amr's vision to him. And the second is that awe, that overpoweringness that Amr cannot stare directly. This is Rasulullah ﷺ. How can you stare at him? You have to sit with dignity. You have to sit with what we call in Arabic hayba and waqar. You show a type of dignity in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And therefore he's saying, even though I love to stare, I couldn't stare. And because of this, I'm always battling between these two emotions. I really cannot do justice in describing the Prophet ﷺ. It's a beautiful hadith that shows us, and this is coming from somebody, he is a nobleman of the Quraysh. And yet this is how humbled he was, just by the appearance. Wallah, just by the shakl, if you like, just by the surah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if Amr ibn al-As could not stare at him as much as he desired, and this is a beautiful point by the way as well, most of the descriptions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they come from the younger Sahaba, not from the older Sahaba. And of the greatest or the most explicit descriptions is from Anas ibn Malik, who was a little kid. So Anas does not have the same type of, if you like, emotions that the elder Amr ibn al-As has. And Anas ibn Malik, he was introduced to the Prophet ﷺ when he was 7 years old. His mother came to him and she gifted her son as a servant. And basically Anas would wake up and run to the Prophet ﷺ's house, stay there all day, and then go back to his mother's house. So he would serve the Prophet ﷺ, fetch him water, do this and that for him. So this is Anas ibn Malik. And so Anas ibn Malik has given us one of the most explicit descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is found in the Shama'il of At-Tirmidhi. Anas ibn Malik says that the Prophet ﷺ was neither very tall such that he stood above the crowd, nor was he short such that he would be ignored. He was in the middle. He was of a medium stature. And the Prophet ﷺ was neither extremely white, and nor was he a ruddy brown. Now, pause here for a while. The Arabs, they called what we call white, they called it yellow. They called it yellow. What we call white is the Caucasian color white. Okay? And this is generally called asfar. And that's why they call the Romans Banu al-Asfar. They call the Romans the tribe of the yellow people. Just like over here the American Indians, what did they call whites? Pale face, right? This is not a skin color that they're familiar with, okay? Generally speaking, when the Arabs use the word white, it is a lightish brown. This is what they call white is a lightish brown. It's not the white that we consider Caucasian white. Okay, that white they called asfar, which then it's not really white, it's yellowish to them. That's how they considered it, okay? So, the Prophet ﷺ was a very lightish color of brown. The actual skin color that he had was a lightish color of brown. A lot of people say he was white. No, he's not white when the English word white, no. When we say the word white, that means he is Caucasian color. No, he wasn't. And by and large, the Arabs were not of that color. right? The Romans were of that color. The Arabs, they had a different color. So the Prophet ﷺ had a lightish, brownish color. So Anas bin Malik is saying, neither was he purely on that side, nor was he ruddy brown, nor was he the rusty brown color. He was in the middle. The Prophet ﷺ's hair was not in curls, nor was it straight. It was firm hair, like most men's hair is. And Anas ibn Malik said that I never felt any velvet or silk softer than the hand of the Prophet ﷺ. His hand was very soft, softer than velvet and silk. And he said, nor did I smell a musk or a perfume more fragrant than the sweat of the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, his natural odor that would emanate from him. The natural odor that would emanate from him, Anas bin Malik said, I never smelt any fragrance more sweeter than this smell. And of course you know that Salama and others, when the Prophet ﷺ would go to sleep, she would in fact collect his sweat in a jar. So it's hot, there's no AC, there's no fan, he's sweating. So she would collect this sweat in a jar, in a small bottle. Why? They would use it as perfume. They would use it as perfume. And they would also use it as medicine. Put it in a drop of water, like this is their medicine. They put it in some water and they drink it. This is the Sahaba, they're living with him, they see with themselves, they smell. They see the reality of the miracle of the Prophet ﷺ. Al-Bara ibn Azib described the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, the Prophet ﷺ was of medium stature. رَجُلٌ مَرْبُوع. He was of medium stature. He wasn't extremely tall, 6'6", nor was he short, 5 foot. No, he was in the middle, of an average stature. And he had broad shoulders. His hair was thick. And by the way, this thickness of hair and lusciousness of hair has been narrated by at least 5 different Sahaba. Kathif al-lihya, and his beard is very bushy, and his hair is very full. And the Prophet ﷺ would usually grow it until it went down to his earlobes, and then he would shave it all off. Let's say he went for Umrah or something, or Hajj, he would shave it all off. But it would typically be low to the earlobes. He would have a full hair. And Al-Bara ibn Azib said that once I saw him wearing a red hulla. Hulla is a cloak, a thing you put over, a type of, what we would call it a jacket. Let's say they didn't have the arms, but over that. And he said, مَا رَأَيْتُ أَحْسَنَ مِنْهُ قَطْ. I never saw anything more beautiful than him on that night that I saw him wearing that red hulla. I never saw anything more beautiful than that. And Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, he also described in a lot of detail the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, and of course Ali was his cousin. Ali was somebody who grew up with him and knew him even before the Risala began. And Ali was his son-in-law. So Ali is a close family member who definitely has seen the Prophet ﷺ more than many of the other Sahaba. Ali ibn Abi Talib says that the Prophet ﷺ did not have a very fleshy face, nor was it completely round. They're trying to describe him as being, imagine now, we're not allowed to draw pictures, obviously the Sahaba didn't draw, so they're trying to use words to get the imagery across. So they're saying, he wasn't like this and he wasn't like that, he was in the middle. His face wasn't fleshy, nor was it round, it was slightly ovalish. He had a whitish skin tinge, and as I explained before what they meant by this, he said white with a reddish tinge. And what they mean by this is, as I said, a lightish brown. It's not the pure white, it is the lightish brown. His eyes were large, with jet black pupils. So he had black eyes, his eyes were large with jet black pupils, and his lashes were long. His joints were large, as was his upper back. So you could clearly see the fingers on his joints. His upper back is broad. The Prophet ﷺ was broad-shouldered. And he did not have hair all over his body. He wasn't hairy on his body. He had hair on his head, and the beard was full. But he did not have hair on his body. But he did have a fine line of hair extending from the chest to the navel. The chest to the navel. So he had the normal masculine hair that is there. When he walked, he would walk briskly, fast. It is sunnah to walk fast. When he walked, he would walk briskly, as if he's descending down a slope. In other words, he's so fast, it's as if he's walking down the slope. Some scholars have also said that it is as if Allah made the earth mudhallal. So Allah made the earth humble to him. That wherever he's walking, it's as if the earth is giving him the place to walk. right? And others said this is metaphorical. What it means is that that the Prophet ﷺ would walk briskly, and he's walking so fast that most of us, we can only walk like that when we're going down an inclined plane. And that is how he would generally walk. When he turned, he would turn to face with his whole body. So he's walking, somebody calls him, he doesn't say yes, no. He turns to face him with his whole body. And subhanAllah, modern presenters and modern speakers, they tell you the exact same advice. That when you speak to somebody, never speak with your head turned. Turn your whole, face him. Speak with him one-on-one. And this we find written 14 centuries ago. And as a footnote here, just a side point, I read a lot of books about public speaking, a lot of books about presenting and whatnot. Wallahi, every single point of benefit that we find that the Prophet ﷺ, he has exactly done this. And I've wanted to give a lecture, maybe someday I will, about the speaking techniques and style of the Prophet ﷺ and how perfect it was. And here we find one thing, just off the top of my head, I'm remembering this, that this is one of the advice that the speakers' committees always give. Turn and face the entire body, face the audience like that. Never just turn the head. Here we find Ali ibn Abi Talib saying, whenever he would turn with his whole body to face the person he is talking to. Between his two shoulders was the seal of the prophethood. Now we're going to talk about this inshallah in a few weeks. The Prophet ﷺ had a physical khatam, physical seal, a physical something that Allah gave him on his body, on his jasad. And this was to be a sign by which he would be recognized by other people. So the Prophet ﷺ had a physical sign, and this sign is the seal of the prophets. And Ali ibn Abi Talib says, he had this seal, and he was the seal of the prophets. وَهُوَ كَانْ خَاتَمَ النَّبِيِّينَ. He is the khatam, and he had the khatam. What is this khatam? We're going to talk about it later, but it is basically a outgrowth of hair in an area where hair does not grow, and it is of a different color. And it was between his shoulder blades, shaped like a pigeon's egg, an oval, small oval, like a pigeon's egg. And it was in a place that nobody's hair grows over. And that's all it was. It wasn't any growth of skin, it wasn't anything abnormal. A small, if you like, growth of hair, of a different color than the usual color of his body, of the hair. And it was in between his shoulder blades, at the bottom of the shoulder blades, over there. And Ali ibn Abi Talib says that between his two shoulder blades was the seal of the prophethood. We're going to hear about this later on, when a number of people accepted Islam, most famously Salman al-Farsi. Salman al-Farsi accepted Islam because his Christian teacher had told him that the sign of the Prophet is that he's going to have the seal between his two shoulders. And so when Salman al-Farsi came, and this is the story, we're jumping the gun here, Salman al-Farsi came to the Prophet ﷺ testing him. Does he have the signs or not? One day he came, he had the first sign, check, he went home. Second day he came, he had the second sign, check, he went home. And these two signs were physical, apparent signs, nothing on the body. The third sign is on the shoulder. How am I going to see the shoulder? So the third day Salman al-Farsi comes, he's wondering, how am I going to see, the Prophet is wearing a shirt, how am I going to see his shoulder? So he walks behind, trying to see, maybe, I see something, I know. And when the Prophet ﷺ saw him walking behind, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ lowered his shoulder, lowered his shirt, and showed him, just without a word being passed. The Prophet ﷺ just lowered it and showed him. You want to see? Khalas, I'll show it to you. Here it is. Because he realized what Salman is doing. And as soon as he saw that, Salman accepted Islam, and he told his long story, which we will give an entire, inshaAllah, lesson about. We continue with Ali's statement that whoever unexpectedly saw him would stand in awe of him. In other words, just if you weren't expecting to see him, you saw him, you would just stop for a millisecond. So much reverence from his body emanating. You would stand in awe of him. And whoever accompanied him and got to know him would love him. Once you got to know him, you would get to love him. And those who described him would always say, now Ali is saying, this is what everybody else says, and this is exactly what everybody else says. What did he say? I have never seen anyone before him or after him who was like him. This is exactly what Ali is saying, the other people say, and this is what we're already saying. Bara said this, and Rubai' said this, and so on. So all of the Sahaba are saying the same thing. I've never seen anyone before him or after him like him. And of course there's a beautiful hadith which is well known to many of you, and that is the hadith of Jabir ibn Samura. Jabir ibn Samura radiallahu ta'ala an, who says that he was going home one day in the middle of the night, and it was a clear moon in the sky, and he's walking home, and he just happens to pass by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was also out in the middle of the night in the streets of Medina, and he was wearing a red hulla, the same red hulla that has already been described by Al-Bara' ibn Azib, red hulla like the red overcovering. And he said, I looked at the face of the Prophet ﷺ, and I looked at the full moon. Now he's physically comparing the two, right? Well, it's amazing, he's literally comparing the two. I looked at the face of the Prophet ﷺ, and there is the full moon. فَوَاللَّهِ, he said, he was more beautiful in my eyes than the full moon. And this really shows us that Allah had given the Prophet ﷺ not just these physical, but these spiritual characteristics that is just emanating from him. And one of the best examples of this is the fact that many people accepted Islam just by seeing his face. The most famous convert like this is the chief rabbi of the Jews of Medina. And his name was Abdullah ibn Salam. Abdullah ibn Salam was the chief rabbi of the Jews, and he was the most respected of the Yahud. And he heard this man coming claiming to be a prophet. So he said, and this was the first day that the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina. The first day. And so he said, let me go see. Now, he wants to go see what his message is, right? Notice, now he's describing in the first person. The hadith is in Bukhari. He's describing in the first person. He said, as soon as I saw him. Now he's not coming to discuss theology. He's not coming to convert to Islam. He's simply coming to see what the commotion is, to see who this guy is, right? He goes, as soon as I saw him, عرفت أن وجهه ليس بوجه كاذب. Soon as I saw him, I knew that this face that he has cannot be the face of a liar. And one conversation and he accepts Islam right then and there. Just by looking at the face of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was not the only one to do so.